Okay, hello and welcome to the second impromptu episode of Dissensus, the show where we don't have to agree and we don't have to agree to disagree. We can just talk about stuff. Let's just talk about stuff. There doesn't need to be a plan. There doesn't necessarily need to be a thesis. We can just have a lot of arguments looping and running in parallel in the glorious way in which actual conversations truly do. My guest, as the first episode of Dissensus, here is the delightful Christine Brophy, who is joining me again. Did you want to give another introduction, just in case they're seeing the second episode first?
I guess so. I mean, I'm much better at it this time.
Go for it.
What is it that I do? Okay, well, I am a combination of, I take things like psychology and game design, and I've kind of used them in their overlapping space in order to help teenagers kind of chart out the next step in their journey of life towards a greater purpose, I guess, or what they will do, at least for a little while, that's in the image of their, how they'll contribute to society. Wow, it was much better the first time. You should just go back and go back to the first. I thought I would be better at it, but
there's no way to encapsulate. There's no way to encapsulate what you're doing is a large thing. Nah, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. Look, this is like when people say, so what do you do for a living? And I'm like, I don't know. I'm a wizard, I guess. I don't know.
But it's one of those things where, like, so in the last episode we talked about being embedded in things. So the two kind of modes of being, which is like the one which is more the feminine principle of like experience and you're embedded in it, and then you get to kind of like step back, and that's more like the agentic one where you can see things like in the third person. And I think maybe yesterday I was more in the third person, looking down at my life and being like, oh yes, this is the greater story that's going on here, and I understand all the connections. And then today I'm like embedded in it. It's like, what do you do?
Where am I?
There's just so many things there's just so many connections.
That's right. So, it's the experience of being in the labyrinth instead of having that God's eye view. I did come across something last night, actually, which I was sort of synchronistic, I suppose, and clicked in, which was this is going to seem like a curve, but it's not. I was looking at techniques for running horror role-playing games, something I do a lot of, right? And I ran a horror role-playing game last night, which had a delightful conclusion of like the sheer looks of like horror and dread on my players' faces before I cut. Always satisfying, right?
Man, I want to ask you right now what happened, but I know that we can't just go off into a little.
Well, that would be that's a whole thing. But let's just say that they're both standing with terrified anticipation and guns drawn beside a drain. That's shaking. I love it. And they're it's not going to be half what's going to happen when we get to the next scene, which I won't spoil. But I was reading this thing afterwards, and it made a very interesting point about the third person view that I hadn't considered before. It's like, if you want to emphasize, and I'm sort of wondering how this plugs in. We don't have to follow this line yet, but it did catch my attention. If we want to emphasize isolation, which is a pretty critical component in horror formulae, right? You want to isolate characters and in stories in horror so that they have fewer and fewer resources drawn, right? If you want to isolate, one of the things you can do is switch from the first person view to a third person. So for instance, they're driving to go deal with something, they're in the car, right? And you switch to a third person view very high up, looking at the car as it weaves the road up the mountain and disappears into green mist. And this like pull away view where you're seeing them smaller and isolated in a car. If you think about it, you see that in films, right? And so it was sort of advocating this as a scene construction in role playing. And I thought about this and I was like, yeah, that's interesting, right? That's another use of the third person. It's a kind of distancing to give a sense of disconnection and isolation. So anyway, it happened to catch my attention, and having been talking about this stuff as we were, I was like, oh, that's interesting. This is another thing that you can do in a sense with playing with that third. And in role playing, of course, you're dealing with first person, second person, third person. You can weave between all three.
Yeah.
Right. Because you can indeed deliver stuff directly to somebody. You do this, you do that. You can deliver, or sorry, second person is they do this, they do that. First person, of course, is you do this, you do that. And then, or well, I suppose it depends whether you're doing prose or role playing, but anyway, and then third person, right? This pullback view. And I thought isolation, I wonder what the connection is, if any, between sort of isolation in that sense, like taking the long view in that sense. And
yeah, anyway. That's so interesting. I mean, so I guess like we could actually dive in right here because we're just in one of the things that, so I have a question and a statement. Yep. So the question, or my statement, I guess, is like, yeah, so something that's like been kind of popping out at me a lot, that I would love for us to like be able to kind of dive into a little bit further, was this idea of like the masculine and the feminine archetypes and kind of their interplay, and that with imagination and creativity and things like that, that they have this idea of the finale or the ultimate union of like the masculine and feminine principles in like the lovers, and that, but that is simultaneously like them like connected, but then also still individuals. So it's like that duality. So this idea has been like standing out to me in patterns in like multiple ways, but it's like been standing on its own. And I guess I kind of wanted to explore it to sort of understand how it connects with other things. And then the question I guess I was going to ask specifically was about your role-playing games that just popped out. Have you noticed an effect that happens when you bounce between like a first person versus third person with your players? Like, does anything happen there? And do you use that tactically, or Right.
Okay. So maybe I'll answer those in reverse order, because I think there's more, I have maybe more to say about the first thing than the second thing. So, so yeah, I mean, definitely there's all kinds of technique that you can use, much as you would with fiction, right? And in some cases, the technique is not dissimilar, but because role-playing games are they're a participatory and somewhat spontaneous form of narrative, of fiction creation, it's always a little curvier, like things don't work exactly the same as they do, but there's a lot you can do, right? Not every person who runs games, for instance, enjoys kind of a storytelling aspect. Like some people will tend to run their games less in character, for instance, right? So they'll narrate what's happening and what people say, but they don't feel comfortable, for instance, I don't know, doing, voices, right? Like playing characters.
Yeah.
I shift back and forth depending on the scene, but I quite enjoy playing characters. And I always like it when I spontaneously sort of generate a character with very little thread, and my players are quite responsive to it. Like I have a character that I've been playing lately that my players have taken an unforeseen shine to, who's this sort of, I don't know, German bike courier, former bike courier turned conspiracy theorist named Lucas Müller. And they love Lucas Müller. It's fascinating to watch, and you get these kinds of things. So I like that kind of immersed, where I'm playing something and it sort of calls them to play in, and all of that is very first person, right? Yeah. It's like you're immersed in the scene, and if people step out of it, I often try to coax them back in and say more actor stance, less director stance, right? Likewise, in some cases, I'm in actor stance. I'm role playing a scene. It's very immersed. I'm doing a minimum amount of description on the basis of the information that the players need to receive, right? Because I'm also playing their senses, as it were, right? But then sometimes I flip over into kind of storytelling mode, which I do very fluidly, I think. So I can tell a fairly complex story at length that I will interject, often putting it into the mouth of a character, but sometimes just sort of spontaneously getting it off. And that has this way of shifting the perspective out to the big view. It does have an effect when so for instance, if you're playing, say, Dungeons and Dragons, right, which is far and away the most common, it's been the touchstone for the hobby for 50 years. And if you're playing that, you can imagine a mode where, obviously you're having an interaction with a character, you're talking to the local barkeep as he polishes his mugs, or you're, talking to the local captain of the guard or whatever, right? And that's going to be a very embedded, sort of framed off scene. It's pretty direct. But then it's not uncommon, if you want to get that kind of mythic or mythological feel, you pull back to third person. and you increase your scope. So you start telling things like, you know, as you would a myth or a fairy tale, right? You know, so you might be like, well, in the days of yore, and times of legend gone by, when the mountains were twice as tall as they are today and dragons roamed the skies, you know, you start getting into that kind of language and pulling your scope back and back, and it almost invariably has an effect. You'd think that removing that first person talking would make people tune out, but it doesn't. It makes them snap in. So when you start getting into a big mythological storytelling thing, the players often quiet down and kind of lean in. They follow it very closely. I'm not sure why, to be perfectly honest. Maybe it's something about like understanding that using that kind of language, you know, denotes a certain kind of significance, mythic significance. It's like, oh, this is an opportunity to learn something about the history or mythology or metaphysics of this world or something, but it tends to kind of tune people in. And so as time has gone by, I've splashed that stuff in pretty liberally. Like sometimes I put it into characters' mouths. Like I had a monologue the other day about, that's a bit grisly, but I had a monologue the other day. Bear in mind, it's a horror game, right?
Yeah,
but I had a monologue the other day about this medical forensics person who they were dealing with, who got into the job because she had an interest in serial killers. And she was talking about the nature in this game of vampiric mind control, right? Because vampires can mind control in this setting, and right? So vampiric mind control. And she says, you know, do you like serial killers? And the character goes, wouldn't say I like them. What do you mean? She's like, well, I've always been interested in the blah, blah, blah. And she started talking about Jeffrey Dahmer. And this is maybe this is very grisly. Okay, so because this is trigger warning. This is a bit grisly, folks. Okay, so this is real history, but it's grisly. So Jeffrey Dahmer, if you don't know, maybe I shouldn't get into this.
Maybe you should go
maybe,
for it.
Okay.
I mean, you gave
all right.
trigger warning.
You're right. Fair enough. Okay. Jeffrey Dahmer, of course, was he was a murderer, a serial killer, he was a cannibal, but also he had a really strong interest in creating sex slaves. This is really grotesque. So he experimented.
A cannibal plus sex slaves. All right.
Sex slaves. Yeah, but I mean, it gets much worse. Like, this is really horrific. I'm warning.
Oh, this is just the prologue.
Okay. So what he attempted to do periodically was that when he had captured one of his victims and, you know, drugged them and taken them home, he did home trepanning. He drilled holes into their skull.
Wow.
And would selectively pour corrosives like Drano in through holes in their skull in the effort to selectively dissolve parts of their brain so that he could keep them as sex zombies.
Sorry, this just brings to mind a certain thought, which is like every time that I hear stories about, like, I often think that, like, you know, people, like, we've all got like this battle of good and evil within us. And like that, you know, the idea of evil is like, sometimes we kind of confuse what's being evil for actually, like, you're not understanding the things that they're focusing on or the things that they're prioritizing, and you're simply prioritizing something else.
Yeah, you just need to take a walk in their shoes, and then you would understand that actually everybody is, you know, they're the hero of their own story, and really they're trying to act towards the maximal good. Yeah, exactly. And then you hit the guy that drills holes in people's heads and pours Drano to make sex zombies. It's hard to frame that way. It's like, well, so what was going on for him?
That's just like, you crossed over the line there, and it's like you remind yourself that, oh yeah, we live in democracy, and when we're in these lovely bounds, we're all these like people that are just struggling for what's right and good, but then you get Jeffrey Dahmer.
Yeah, you know, so
so as you were saying,
I have a position on this, actually, on the question. This is my so-called Monster Island position. We can come back around to that, but anyway, sorry, that's really grisly. But the point was, I started going through this, right, and it's horrific. If you don't know this stuff, and it's actually horrific, right? It's stomach turning and scary and horrifying and like terrifying, or at least I've always found it so. And so in narrating this whole thing in a very intense way, and then, you know, and then finally the wraparound was, and that's what they do to you, but much more subtly, with thought. They work their way into your head and selectively remove pieces of you until you do what they want. And the first thing that they do is make sure that you can't see them. And then they make you forget that you can't see them. Had a wonderful effect, right? Players were spooked right out. Right. So anyway, long story short, this is clearly something where to some extent I'm pulling back from the immediate action, even though it's coming out of a character's mouth. Right. Yeah. So theoretically it's framed within the scene, but really it's something that's taking this longer view and connecting it up. And I like to do that a lot. I bring in a lot of history. That's games, right?
There's something that just so when I was reading Greg Hurwitz's first book in the series, it's his famous series. Why can't I remember the name right now? Wow. I'm going to Google it just quick because
what's it about?
The name. It's like an action series. It's completely outside. Orphan X.
Oh, okay. I don't know those ones.
Yeah, so it's very much like Jason Bourne style, and these are not novels that I normally read, but I was like, I really gotta read this. So I read the first book in the series, and there's this one piece of it where the two characters are having this conversation in the bathroom. The woman's like crying. I think that she's on like the floor of the bathroom, and I forget exactly what she was crying about or what the circumstance was, but the man, the main character of this, he was in there with her, and then they have this sort of like philosophical discussion about that, how messy it can be basically when you're in a relationship, and when that you kind of have this drive for perfection that comes from being alone, but you're alone, so it's not really perfect. And that was like kind of like the philosophical takeaway, and it just it was one of those moments where you have these characters that are navigating something that is much deeper in this scene, but it's just like a fiction book, and you just think that it would just be like a silly book. And Stephen King has these moments in his books as well, where it's like suddenly the characters are talking about a deep human truth. And maybe it like this is where it kind of links to, if you think about it as snapping out to a third person or to like a mythical sense, which is like what I wrote this down, that myths are defined as like they're not history, but instead they're patterns that repeat, like that are basically repeated human experiences of things that we go through. And that when you have characters in a fictional story just suddenly pop out and touch on one of those truths, it's like,
yeah, it raises the hair on the back of your neck.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, Stephen King, I think, is for some reason unfairly, I think, sort of tarred with a certain brush. Like people, I think of him as writing schlock. Stephen King does not write schlock. He's look, sometimes he writes schlock. So some of his stuff, it's like, when you're writing 19 books a year or whatever, occasionally you're gonna, what was the Simpsons line? A lamp monster. Sometimes you're gonna do stuff like that. But by and large, he's an exceptionally skilled craftsman. He does what he does really, really well. And he's a guy who, he's one of these people that I simultaneously envy and have like angry envy. I have positive envy and like angry envy towards positive envy, because I'm like, it's just so impressive. The guy's a machine. Yeah. When I was a full-time writer, I sort of aspired to be able to write in this way. And I'll never forget the time that I was reading, I think it was On Writing, and his book On Writing, which is excellent. And and he was like, you just have to remember the first 1,000,000 words are practice. Yeah. and as like a 23-year-old or something, I was like, what? What do you mean? Like, I've written like 150,000 words and I feel pretty happy about it. First 1,000,000 words are practice. That smacked me, right? And when you hear about how the guy writes, like he sits down at the typewriter, or probably not a typewriter anymore, but back in the day, a typewriter, and he winds a piece of paper in and tick, 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 tick. He writes, and he just writes all day. He doesn't take time off. He takes off like 1 day a year. And when he finishes a novel, you'd think when he finished a novel, he would like the end, and he'd set it to one side and be like, I think I'm going to take the rest of the day off. It's 3. I'm going to knock off early. No, he winds another piece of paper to the typewriter and just starts the next story. Like he's constructed himself into some kind of streamlined machine for doing this, and he can't turn it off. he's tried to retire a few times, and I know what that feeling's like.
I didn't know that he's tried to retire. Really?
Several times, and he can't do it.
Yeah, well, of course not. I mean, he's like, well, it's a different way of this, but he's like a soldier that's like, you know, gone into battle and like who's constructed himself for a very specific mission.
Yep.
And to pull himself out of that world after he's been training himself to do this thing for decades. Like, it's just.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, he's going to wake up the next day and be like, all right, and go back in. You know? Yeah. It's one of these reminders to me anyway, and we'll come back around to this too, I guess, but it's one of these reminders to me that's like, be careful what you turn yourself into, you know? In his case, it seems to have worked out reasonably well, but like what you do is what you turn yourself into. We all turn into something different if related, but you got to be careful about what you turn yourself into.
There's a couple quotes that like from when I was reading this morning that I wrote down. Two of them were one becomes what one beholds, and you are what you identify with. And this idea of like being careful what you're going to turn yourself into. This kind of goes back around to like this idea of the masculine and the feminine that like I've just been trying to play around with and understand. And that like that the cyclical nature of what you get to do when you're role playing, for example, where you get to pop into one, you go into the experience that you identify with something, but then there's a set endpoint to it where you then get to walk away from it. And that's when you can kind of look at it from the third person then, I guess, and you can kind of integrate whatever you learned or the piece of that stuck with you, I guess, into yourself, but it's not really like an egocentric thing. It's like, well, how are you going to carry that forward, sort of?
Sometimes.
Okay.
Like the lines are not always that clean. So, okay. So on the masculine and feminine thing, I mean, I should probably say that I am not, in the sense, an orthodox Jungian, right? In the sense that, like, I have a different conception around this to some extent. Like, I think that when we're discussing masculine and feminine, it's approximately the same metaphorical level as talking about them as the sun and the moon. I don't think that the sun and the moon, or I don't think that these things are sort of fundamentally tied to, fundamentally tied to biological gender at quite the same level as Jung himself might have. And I think a lot of it has to do with a kind of reciprocal, reflective relationship between persona within Jung's system, persona and soul, or what he called contrasexual soul image. And a lot of that is highly, highly, highly culturally determined. So my things around this are a little softer. And likewise, I don't share Jung's position on, for instance, homosexuality, right? Where he sees this as a misidentification and deviation. I'm like, I don't see any reason for that. Just doesn't, it's not consistent with the original Greek notions that fuel a lot of this stuff. And, but also, that kind of fundamental thing that one hits sometimes when discussing this, where it's like you're dealing with the masculine and the feminine as though they're these fundamental poles in some sense, is actually belied by the later stages of the process. So, you get, the male, the masculine and the feminine, whatever. And then of course there is this expression, which is the lovers, as you said, right? Yeah. But that isn't the ultimate expression, actually, when you look into the sort of the deeper alchemical literature. In fact, the divine marriage, right? The hieros gamos, as they say, is actually a midpoint stage. And after that, you get further stages, like, for instance, the mystical hermaphrodite. Well, the mystical hermaphrodite is a figure that exists as a kind of literal fusion. Now, bearing in mind that most of this is not meant to be representative of necessarily your relationship with another person per se, except in a transjective way, but rather your internal relationships. It's about you coming to a relationship with your own inner components. And it's not just about them fusing into one part, and it's not about them remaining completely separate either. It's about them developing a more complex relationship with each other. And see, this is like this kind of thing I'm doing with my hands. This is what Google is always picking out in my, I'm always doing this kind of stuff. And so I looked at the thumbnail on the one that we did a couple of days ago, and you're like smiling and I'm going like this. Anyway, doesn't matter. So, there's a more complex relationship, and then that more complex relationship tends to yield a kind of offspring, which then remains distinct from the two original points. And so you see this, for instance, in the axiom of Maria Prophetessa, which says the one begets the two, which begets the three, and the third begets the fourth, which is the one. which
I've never heard that before. That's interesting.
It's an axiomatic alchemy. It's an alchemical thing. Early,
interesting.
2nd century, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I just know of it from like the Holy Trinity and that with Jesus, that idea, and that was something else like why is the third necessary? That's like anyway. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, of course, Jung pointed out, as lots of people have pointed out, that there's actually a bit of an imbalance in the Trinity because it's just like overwhelmingly masculine, right? And in some ways, informally, I mean, it's this funny thing, right? Like, you don't find a monotheistic culture, so far as I can tell, anywhere that doesn't immediately come up with a set of folk polytheisms. So nominally, right, Roman Catholicism is supposed to be monotheist, but then immediately we get, well, yeah, it's monotheist, but there's God the Father and there's God the Son, and there's also the Holy Spirit, all of which have distinct functions. There's also Mary. She got to bypass things, and you can ask her to intercede with stuff. Oh yes, and saints and angels. Right, and the various prophets of the Old Testament who got directly vacuumed into heaven, and you can appeal to them for certain. And it's like it rapidly becomes a pantheon.
Yeah.
Right, and then of course the devil actually has an independent opposed status. It's not like the early Old Testament where it's just a job description.
Yeah.
The early Old Testament, he's just the adversary. It's a job description. He works for God. Yeah. Then later he's like his enemy. So anyway, this kind of polytheism, in the same kind of way, it seems to me that you get the feminine reinclusion happening anyway, but with the Trinity, and it's hard to know exactly what the shape of that thing is. Like, where does Mary fit? I don't know. Is that the 4th point? Who knows, right?
Yeah.
But okay, wait a minute. But let's loop this back around. Masculine, feminine. Oh, I know. I was just looking to say, like, transcending that principle of just the lover towards a deeper kind of fusion actually, I think, touches in some ways on the relatively complex relationship that one has when they're engaged in the sort of perspective taking of role playing. That's what I was getting at.
Okay.
So yes, it's true that in an ideal circumstance, one can don a certain kind of set of traits and certain kinds of performative whatever, right? You can play other roles. You can try things on. This is one of the great things about role playing. So I get to do, as I've told people, a ton of shadow work through role playing because my players expect me to be an evil son of a bitch, right? They expect it.
Yeah.
If they don't get that, they'll be disappointed. They want somebody to treat them poorly, hurt them, threaten them, right? Run them through the gauntlet, crush them, foil them, right? They want it.
Yeah.
And that sounds sort of masochistic when I say it like that.
I was just going to say.
But it's not. I mean, it's the essence of sort of like, drama is in conflict, right? A story with no conflict. And most of this stuff is genre. So you're going to get not so much drama really most of the time as melodrama. When you start introducing drama and the moral complexities of drama, a lot of players will, they don't almost like that. They want melodrama. Who's the bad guy? Him? We can kill him. Right?
Yeah, don't pull out my own vulnerabilities.
Right. And so my players used to hate my guts back in the day sometimes because, I would do that thing where they, killed a whole group of like raging orc barbarians or something only to get into the back of the cave and find all of the like orc mothers and orc babies. They hated it when I did this kind of stuff, right? And to be fair, I was kind of cramming it down their throat back in the day, but
you will transform.
Yeah, that's right. Consequences, moral consequences. So like I said, right, I get to do a lot of shadow work and it's terrific. It is an actual, a rare space, right? I expect that maybe being a dominatrix may fall into this space also, okay? The other kind of dungeon master. And, because you are doing scenes in a sense, from what I understand. And the thing is that you're being paid to don the aesthetics of evil, right? You're being paid to play at something which is like abuse, humiliation, harm, whatever, right? But to engage the other person in their own shadowy spaces. And so, I mean, it's fantastic. I get to be, as one of my players called me a while back, a magnificent bastard, right? And I can work that out, and then I don't have to work it out in the real world, and everybody has a good time. We all walk away.
I was just going to say that this is also the same thing as apprenticeship. It's like when you first enter into a relationship with somebody that you admire, and then you're taking on a role or even a job, you are doing that according to the image of like the ideal in that scenario, or according to their philosophy, the type of thing that you believe that they would like to see. So like, for example, you're trying on like being a bartender or something, you're going to play the role of like more of an extrovert or gregarious if you're trying to be the best bartender or something like that. But it's a role that you're stepping into and identifying with.
Yeah, you fake it till you make it in everything. You know, ask a resident doctor when they're off the clock and they've had a couple of drinks, whether or not they have imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And like everybody does, right? Everybody has imposter syndrome, seemingly. And imposter syndrome is just it's the flip side, right? So if we look at Vygotskian zone of proximal development, right? So, in the Vygotskian zone of proximal development, it's imitative. You're internalizing through play, as we were talking about yesterday, but you're internalizing, right? And at first you imperfectly mimic. Kids do this all the time, right? So my sister's oldest child, when they were little, went through this whole period where every time they sat down on the couch, they would go, ah, and people couldn't figure out what was going on. And then, of course, we realized that, they're just around adults all the time, and we're all old. So when we sit down on the couch, we go, because we're taking and they just internalized it, but with no, right? And there's lots of interesting evidence around this kind of internalization. When we take on a role, we're doing the same thing. It's a bit more complex, but we're just faking it till we make it. You see it with undergrad papers, right? That sort of try to use something that sounds like philosophy to the untrained ear. And the instinct that many people have is to squash that. But actually that's wrong. It's an imperfect expression, but they're trying to get the persona, they're trying to get the language down, right? But when your self-confidence bottoms out, then you have imposter syndrome. Ergo, imposter syndrome is actually a sign that you're in the zone of proximal development and therefore growing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, totally. It's so interesting that you said the idea of them trying on things too, and then people squashing it. I know I encounter that a lot when it comes to teenagers and their visions of the future that they set for themselves. And what happens sometimes when you're an adult and that you look upon their vision of the future and it seems like it's stereotypical or something, or you ask them what their bucket list is and they'll all sound the same. And it's well, they haven't thought about it enough, or they need to think about it harder because they're not doing a very good job at it. And it's no, it's a level of resolution that they just don't have the nuanced experience of having walked through these things and tried on even more roles to kind of, add some dimension, some color to that picture. So it's a perfectly fine first go at it.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it's a weird expectation that people have that, you should know better. How should I know better? I'm 12. How should I know better, right? I just haven't lived that much. Most of my experience is media experience, and most adults are, frankly, fumbling the ball all the time. How am I supposed to know? It's not clear at all, right? What's interesting, I think, in there, and partly the reason that I said, you get to step in and step out is, of course, there's all of the cases where you don't step in and step out. So, for instance, so in the 80s, right? Dungeons and Dragons, for those who recently watched the last season of Stranger Things, which dealt notably with the Satanic Panic. I mean, this was a historical thing, right? D&D was getting its books burned, and I don't know why. But anyway, the point was that it got labeled as a satanic activity, right? And then there were all these stories that, you came across in the media. There was Mazes and Monsters, which was a novel, but about kids that play D&D and go nuts. They made a film of it, starred Tom Hanks. He tries to jump off the Sears Tower. It's not very good. They did a bunch of these things. There was the Darkest Dungeon. No. Dark Dungeons, which is a chick tract, a religious propaganda tract. If you want to go read that online, I highly recommend it. It's amazing. It's been quoted by gamers for 20 years now. But the thing is that in many of those cases, these stories all revolve around the same thing: people adopting a role and being sucked in. The satanic subtext is there too, but a lot of the time it has to do with this danger involved in role playing, that by pretending to be this character, you would fuse with this character in some way, or right, that it would start to cause you to go nuts.
Well, the release of inhibition also being the way how people are inducted into cults.
Right, and there could definitely be a certain quality of that, right? Because certainly in the 80s and probably later, role-playing games were often a very high inclusion setting. People that didn't have social traction in other settings at the time were sort of, it was like everyone is welcome kind of thing in a really, right? So you got a lot of social outcasts often playing it. But although not exclusively. The weird thing about it is, of course, the industry did backflips, right, to try to quash this idea that role-playing games are anything other than a bit of fun. And that's a half-truth, right? It's like, I would say, strongly analogous to what happened historically with hypnotism. So hypnotism, right, turned out to be this really terrific tool in the early 20th century. And then there was a whole rash of hypnotic crimes, right, where people were hypnotized or whatever, hypnotizing for criminal ends, right? And the sort of therapeutic industry, the like psychological association and stuff, basically came together and said, we can't let them take this tool away. Like, we need to do something to safety this up. And that's when the party line came together, that hypnosis can't make you do anything you don't want to do, and it's all voluntary, and all hypnosis is self-hypnosis, and right. And then gradually that eroded away further to the popular idea that there was nothing to hypnosis at all. Well, hypnosis was empirically established more than 10 years ago. It is a really real thing. And if you ask me, it's also pretty clear that hypnosis is, in fact, under certain conditions, capable of abuse. Because, like, it's induced dissociation. Of course you could use that for ill. Right?
I believe that there was a principal at a school that was actually fired because he came in and he used a program on the kids. Like, it was a school that was struggling, I believe. And he started to use a program of hypnosis on the kids to help them to overcome their fears. Only, I guess, a couple kids, I think that they committed suicide.
Oh, shit.
And it was kind of bizarre, the circumstances under which it came about. So then the parents were all like, because they were just suddenly acting weird. So the association was made with the hypnosis club, and they got rid of the principal.
Oh, wow. Okay, you got to fill after we're
I
done.
gotta look that up.
Shoot me some information on that. Yeah, that's right up my alley. Role-playing games, I think, did a similar thing. They backed off and said, look, it's just a game, it's a bunch of fantasy fun, and that is largely the case. However, anybody that's gamed for any length of time, I think, right? And I mean, I'm coming up, well, no, did I pass 40 years I've been doing this? So you encounter people who really are over-invested and over-absorbed. It's not, over time, it's become easier and easier to predict the cases in which this will happen, right? People who often have troubled home lives, not a lot going on in their own time, right, can get plugged into something where, of course, right, the world in which they exist as the character is massively more interesting, rewarding, and fulfilling than the world in which they are customarily absorbed. And this is the same thing that I think video games do to people, right? They hijack flow states. Nothing wrong with video games, in my opinion. I like video games, but it's very easy to fall into the video game as your primary point of reference, because it's got a structured set of understandable goals in an understandable world that rewards you for those goals, where what you're doing can feel good, right?
Yeah.
It's like when you're going to kill the Skeleton King, you're probably doing the right thing.
Yeah.
It's hard to do the right thing in the world.
It's a space that you've navigated before. And I just kind of I draw this back to the idea of of goals that you have for yourself that are old goals that you've set. And it's a space that you've developed some expertise in, and a career path that you've developed some expertise in, that once it's reached its point of death, it's difficult to let go of, because that was a space where you understood it. You understood the outcomes of certain actions. You understood the people and your relationships with them within that context. So it's a known space, and to have to part with it and to let go of it, to go back to a space of like where you're just kind of flailing and reacting to things. It's terrifying.
It's powerfully seductive. And so there are people that fall into that and become over-identified, right? With their characters, with this role that they're playing. And I've seen that happen. I've seen it happen to players. And generally speaking, for the most part, most players do not fall into this kind of trap. Although even players that don't, right? Like, see, it sounds so weird sometimes, I think, to people when you say things like this, but there have definitely been cases, okay, where a character died in game in one of my longer running games. And when that character died, game was done for the evening. Like, we stopped. We stopped and we got out the good scotch. I mean, basically, we would have a wake. Now, this was not planned. It wasn't cute. It wasn't meant to be. This was like a heavy moment. What's the heaviness? What's the heaviness? Same thing. You've heard this before, and I've talked about this before, but a player of mine who's been playing with me for, 6 years now, I guess. We had a moment in my Godlike game. And Godlike, the premise of Godlike is superheroes in World War II. So they had gone to the French city of, wasn't Cannes. Where was it? Anyway, it doesn't matter. They were fighting in a French city, and they were fighting against an SS officer who could turn himself into a Godzilla-sized T-Rex. So, as one does. So they were having this fight, and they had a group of soldiers with them. Okay, so one of the characters, this player, had a group of soldiers. These are just regular soldiers, just like grunts, right? Basically. And in the ensuing battle, the SS Godzilla, the Donnerkönig, swung his tail, crushed the building that they were in, and falling bricks killed like 3/4 of these soldiers. Okay, and when we were done the game, this player comes to me and he's like, "I'm sad. Why am I sad?" And I said, "You're sad because your men died." And he said, "But there were no men." And I said, "Exactly. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter." The men, such as they were a single, not even a first name, a last name, private last name, a single character trait, Cajun, chews gum, whatever, always has papers in hand, like some basic character tag that I could use to identify who was speaking when they were speaking. And then like a couple of numbers to indicate skills, radio 3, gun 2, that's it. They had made a few minor appearances where they had done scenes where I had spontaneously role-played them, but the character was attached. It doesn't take very long to get attached in these things.
I was just going to say, like, how long does it take have you seen it take?
You can get, if you're running a good session and somebody is sort of in the space and isn't playing it ironically, you can get somebody attached in a session.
That's so, like, there's something in coaching that we do as well, like where you'll watch a player, and if you spot a skill of something that they just do like once, even it's not even something that like they've developed well, but it's one thing and that's going to help them in their game. If you compliment them in a way that is who they are, that if you'll watch their eye kind of like just like light up, and then if you watch them over the following sessions, like a session or two on the court, suddenly like you see that they've now identified with that compliment and with that piece of their game, and then suddenly that piece of their game will just explode.
Sure.
And it's
no, absolutely. And you can use that to do things where actually they may not in fact have a strong skill. So for instance, in role playing, right, a bunch of the games that I've run were for they were like professional games that I did for a private school, and I was working with kids on the autism spectrum, teens on the autism spectrum, and teens with ADHD. And so with teens on the spectrum, a lot of the time they were quite socially shy. They were often kind of quiet or kept to themselves in one way or another. But if you have a scene where those characters are, trying to like rally the local soldiers to a battle, right? And you say, okay, like I want you to role play it, and they might be reticent to do it, right? I don't know, whatever, I just do it, and then want to just roll the dice and let the number speak. And you're like, no, look, you got to give a speech. It doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be long, just give a speech.
Yeah.
Right? And so they get up out of their chair and they stand there and they fidget and they like shoegaze and twist their toe. And then finally they say, like, okay, everybody, like, bad guys out there, let's go get them. And then, of course, what you do is you have the table, the other players, but also you as the DM have the non-existent crowd erupt into cheering. Yeah, like, watch that kid light up. And what you have done is systematically notch them towards opening up. It's a very predictable process in a way, because their brain doesn't distinguish really.
Yeah.
Right. What they're doing is getting a huge amount of praise and reinforcement for doing this thing. And right. To the point where some of the kids who came out of that program ended up going into like theater. Like they do like little theater. You never would have expected this, but it becomes quite remarkable. Like they develop a real taste and attachment for performance. So you can do the same thing. You can either pick out that skill. It's like, hey, that thing you're doing is really good. Do that. But also you can emphasize the thing that they're not doing especially well in the same setting and make it seem as though it's good in a way that then emphasizes their desire to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. This just brings up like another thought for me that is something that I've just kind of like often wondered about, which is like, of course, authority figures don't have such extreme control where like you could just throw at absolutely any compliment to the individual and they would believe it. And then that would just like explode. Like they don't like, it has to be something that is relevant to them. That like is perhaps something that they need that they didn't know that they needed. Or it is like truly a strength that the external world can see. But I also wonder if there is ways, like obviously there are ways that authorities can like warp this sort of that power. But anyway,
all power is warpable.
Yeah.
That's what power is. It's what makes it power. And dangerous. Potentially. For sure. And and you can obviously use, I think you have to be careful with it, but the same thing goes for, like negative stuff, criticism. You have to be careful with that kind of thing. But once you already have somebody's ear, once they already trust you, then your ability to offer critique, even quite sharp critique, goes up. Well, that same student actually who became a bit of a thespian, right? His acting skills went up and up. He would not open his mouth at the table. In the final game, he gave a whole soliloquy about the nature of kingship that floored everybody, and then he went in a little theater, right? And so far as I know, he's still doing that. That same student at one point, I had to pull aside and just say, "What are you doing?" And he's like, Laura, I forget, he was being difficult. And I said, "Look, don't be an asshole." And he kind of blinked, and I was like, "Don't be an asshole. Just don't be an asshole. People here are being friendly with you. Don't be an asshole." And he was like, "Okay."
Was he just like, was he being an asshole and then he was like going a little bit too far?
He was doing a thing that lots of young men in particular, but not necessarily young men, do, where they deal with their potential sense of loneliness or their outsider status in one way or another by becoming prickly or sarcastic or naysaying. They become, often sort of negative in one way or another. And there's a time and a place for that. And frankly, it can even be kind of charming, right? In the right circumstance, somebody who really creatively cuts something to pieces and they have like the language to do it can be quite funny, right?
Yeah.
But they develop a prickly persona and it's defensive. Of course it is, right? But then like most of these things, the problem is that, especially for young people, they learn how to wield a hammer and then everything looks like a nail. So they use that everywhere. It's the same with like and this is also often particular to young men. I don't know why. Maybe they don't, they're not sort of socially conditioned to have the same kind of flexibility or something, but they'll learn how to wield the rationality sword, right? And then everybody look out. Rationality sword, here comes rationality sword. And it'll be like, this is the person who learns how to do a little bit of rational thinking. They learn some rational tools, a little bit of logic, right? A little bit of probability, a little bit of, learning like logical fallacies. right? But then they proceed to swing this thing all over the place, right? Cut everything, cut every argument to ribbons, attack everything. And it's like, this is no way to be. There's got to be some give and take. This is not a universal tool. You can't just, but that's a tough sell. It's a useful tool. It is a useful tool. It's a useful tool, but then, people are like, oh yeah, this is my tool. And they lean into it and they want to solve every problem. And like, what is not a great tool by and large for like fostering and preserving relationships? The rationality sword.
Well, it's like what you were saying about, again, like if we loop it back to the difference between the third person versus the first person, where the third person you get to like zoom out, and it's something that seemed like smaller, and like the object in front of you, or like a little tiny car going down a highway in a horror film. And that's the it's how you can wield the rationality sword. And it's it's the opposite of connection that you get there when you're doing that. Yeah.
And it has its place. It's not a bad thing. But as I sometimes say to my clients, actually, when they're sort of fixated on using one tool, using rational language when they should be using emotional language, or when they would benefit from it, whatever, right? And I say, like, you can't just use one tool for everything. If you think you can, try to cut a cake with a hammer. You can do it. It's doable. You can cut a cake with a hammer.
Yeah.
Right. But you're not typically going to get optimal results.
No, of course
and
not.
So, it's about fitting the tool. Likewise, you can screw in a screw with a dime. You can hammer in a nail with a can of soup. I've done this. You do a lot with a can of soup.
It takes a lot more time. That's the thing, is like, so I know when I was going through like a career change, and I had, I guess like I was very much using like my like intellectual sort of rational mind primarily, and I was getting this feeling of being more and more lonely because my work was drawing me away from personal connection with other people. Not only like speaking about political ideology and research behind that as I found that I was talking more and more about that research, it was entering me into rooms and entering into discussions that were having the opposite impact of what I was hoping my research would have, which would be, yes, if only you understood the differences between you, that you would somehow then understand one another and be able to form a better discussion, which I've consistently found that the more that you talk about personality differences, it's got its place. It does help, but it does not help in the way of forming a bottom-up connection with someone. Really? I would say it does.
So that's very interesting. Can you say a bit more about that? So because, okay, so premise off the bat, it is the case maybe that if you propositionally give people the information that shows distinction, that is just not the same as giving them a procedural way of doing so, or a perspectival way of doing so, or whatever, right? It's not the same as walking around in their shoes. But I'm actually quite curious to hear about it, because that, I got to admit, that does violate my intuitions a little bit. I thought that in a situation where you were like, well, you have to understand the differences in personality and openness and conscientiousness and closure, ambiguity. And so I'll shut up.
No. I mean, I'll try my best to like say more. So basically what it does is it helps you to say that person's weird. Like, oh, that thing that you do is just because you're different than me. Like, it's like, you're like that because you're high on this, which makes you weird. Like, you're away from my norm. So that makes you different. That's like what it does, what it helps you do. So you can understand bizarre behavior from your own perspective. Because you're sitting at a certain norm based on your display of traits that you have, or where you land on them. And then you encounter somebody. So it helps you sit with differences, I would say. It helps you to sit with differences and to be able to kind of categorize them, but it doesn't help you to relate and empathize. Yeah.
So when you talked about this material, did you discuss it in terms of demographic distribution? Like what it looks like across the population, how many people this, how many people that?
No, so it wasn't so much talking about, distribution across the population. It was more like types. So like the type of people, like what set of traits would kind of predict a certain political belief or a set of beliefs, or, the types of things that they would support, policies that they would support and things like that. But when you talk about things like the big five, agreeableness, or when you're talking about something like compassion, if you're low in compassion and you're thinking of somebody who's high in compassion, you've got this stereotypical sort of view of them. You don't know, like, it's not pointing to, this is what that feels like in your own personal experience, that kind of draw or acting on that value or that sort of emotion. That's what the compassion feels like and how it paints the landscape for you. So then you just kind of see them as this like archetypal, or like this little like cartoon character that's acting, which will then lead you to draw explanations of like why they're doing the things that they're doing or why they're believing a certain thing, which tends not to, it doesn't lead to empathy. That's all that's, that's all I can say.
No, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. I have encountered, I've encountered lots of cases where people who are using Big Five language are either using it to sort of self-marginalize, or they're establishing norms within the system. So for instance, right, the idea that neuroticism equals bad, right? It's like it's just bad. Right? So you just don't want it. And this doesn't quite sit for me, right? It's not that I don't think that neuroticism isn't maybe bad in some circumstances, but like I just take it as a given that, Tanstaffel, right? There ain't no such thing as a free lunch. For every circumstance where something is useful, there's an equal number of circumstances where it is an impediment. For every instance where it's a heuristic, there is an equal instance where it's a bias. You want to be able to shift, right? But I do encounter people pretty routinely that are like, no, the thing that you want is you want high conscientiousness, and you want high or low neuroticism, and you want openness. Seems to be sort of on the fence. People can't decide.
People can't really decide on that one.
They can't decide. Being very high openness myself, I'm for it.
Exactly.
But you get that, and then you get people self-marginalizing. So I'll talk to people and they'll be like, oh, well, I have a very high such and such score, so I'm a weirdo. And it's like, well, you're out on one tail. Does that make you a weirdo? I think everybody's a weirdo, so that's easy for me. But that's interesting.
It's it's not to say that like there is a lot of value to having those the traits, like in the same way that you were saying before, when we were talking about identity politics the other day, and that it is important to have like labels and identifiers, because when somebody's going through a complex circumstance, or like things are kind of like unexplainable, weird stuff is happening, and then if you're able to sort of put that into like an external category, that again, shifting to the third person of like, this is something that's independent of you that you can understand, then it helps you to put like a nice little box around it, which can be helpful as part of the transformative sort of experience to help you like move forward 100%.
Sure.
But there's this other component to it, which I was personally encountering, which is like the downside of those traits, or of the Big Five, and working with them when you're trying to foster political conversations across the board, or across the aisle. It wasn't having the impact that I was hoping it would have.
Okay, so this is super interesting to me, and I got a couple of questions. So first off, okay, the having sort of labels, handles, right? Some kind of even imperfect system or schema or structure that you can, right? A framework that you can grab onto to render things somewhat explicable. Of course, that's going to reduce your general level of uncertainty. It's going to give you something to grab onto. You look no further than a circumstances that both of us and lots of other people have experienced, where it's like, I have mystery symptoms. What's going on with me?
And then you get like a medical terminology, and it's like, it's this. It's like, oh, well, thank goodness.
Thank God.
Right, now I can
the demon.
I can move on. I can understand those symptoms.
That's right. We've named the demon, and this is why I find it sort of vaguely hilarious and frustrating every time I come across this. As I sometimes do, somebody says, you have well, it turns out you have idiopathic sleep disorder. And this sounds fine as long as you don't know what idiopathic means, because what idiopathic means is idiopathic sleep disorder means we don't know what's going on.
It's the diagnosis of fibromyalgia. It's like, you've got unexplained pain.
Yeah, fibromyalgia seems like they're zoning in on something.
They are zoning in on it now, yeah.
But idiopathic is, I know that they're still going back and forth. There are doctors that don't accept it. It seems pretty real to me. Mm-hmm. But idiopathic is just straight up like, we have no idea. We don't know. Yeah. What's the etiology of this? Cosmic rays, maybe? Leprechauns? Not sure. Not sure. Yeah, but I suggest you put out, just in case, you put some tinfoil on your roof to hedge out cosmic rays, and you put out a saucer of cream so that the local leprechauns and brownies are well pleased with you and will repair your boots. It's just, you don't know. People forget that medicine in many ways is far less a science than an art. Far less a science than an art. Although there is science in it. No, I got no problems with modern medicine. Well, that's not exactly true, but I still think it's useful. Okay, so I understand, right? Naming the demon, getting a schema, same thing in mental health. The amount of relief that a client will receive, often if they're going through something and it's like, oh yeah, so what you're experiencing is called this. Yeah. Just naming it, right, often will produce this tremendous relief. And then they're like, okay, now I know sort of where to look or how to think about it. That could be very useful.
I can operate on it. Yeah.
That's right. And that can be for themselves or for somebody else, It can be remarkably effective if you just, somebody's talking and, you just say, wow, yeah, that person in your life sounds like a narcissist. And they're like, thank you. Right? And leaving aside the joke that everybody's ex-girlfriend is borderline and everybody's ex-boyfriend is a narcissist. Right? But, in some cases, obviously there really is that. And naming it is important. But in terms of you have a group of people, you're talking about Big Five. That group is presumably somewhat homogenized or centralized in terms of its, politics / location within the Big Five metrics. Okay, if you're addressing a group of people in this way, it doesn't move them towards empathy. So they see it, but they see it not as an archetype, but as a stereotype. Right? So they see this cartoonish version. And the distinction I'm making here is, right, stereotypes sort of simplify things into a cartoon form. And an archetype does that, but it has a living quality to it that recognizes it as an essential part of human condition, right?
I like that differentiation. That's a good one. Yeah.
So, yeah. And so this is what I'm like, okay, so for instance, if you have a group of people who are homogenized into one aspect of that spectrum, is there not also simultaneously the recognition that this statistical distribution of traits occurs genetically and by population and by training across the species? And so like how does one fight it, or why would one fight it? Like, it's going to happen. It's just going to keep happening forever.
Well, because the argument against that is that that one side will take is that those things are socially determined, that they're not biological.
Okay, fair, and that's probably half true.
Yeah. Well, if it's 50, everything is 100% biological and 100% social construct. That's
you and I've talked about this before. I find every time I come across nature versus nurture in an article or something, I want to scream at the magazine because I'm like, it's both. It's both.
We can just walk away from it. We figured it out. Both.
It is surprising which are which, though. Some of the things that have influence are like, whoa, really? That is surprising. But anyway, okay, so that's fine. If you're going towards there is a social condition, but let's say that you accept a certain amount of biological determinism, or is it just that everybody who's looking to shift the political spectrum, like looking to pull the Overton window in their direction, is necessarily relying on the social conditioning rather than the genetic level of things? Like, how does that work?
So hold on one second. So you're saying that you're surprised that they were not just like at ease by the fact that there were these individual differences that sort of predict where they would land?
Yeah, I mean, if there's a standard distribution in the population, I mean, think about it this way. Let's say that, I don't know, whatever. You have an equal number in your population genetically of people who, can and can't smell asparagus in their pee. Okay, which is a strict, so far as I know, a strict Mendelian trait, right? Some people eat asparagus, they can smell in their pee. Other people, no dice. Okay, fine. So it doesn't make sense to me then at that point for there to be a whole lot of people getting, worked up and fusty about whether or not somebody has that gene or doesn't have that gene, because it's going to occur with equal incidence. And so you should just accept that some people can smell asparagus in their pee and some people can't. Maybe that's a bad example.
Well, so here's the thing though, is then like you believe that your set of things, that the world that you know it's right, that you've got the better version. And so then therefore those other traits are just kind of like,
okay. So it's more like saying then some people have color vision, but some people are color blind. It's like that.
Yeah, those traits are getting in the way of you seeing reality. That's the problem.
Right. I see. Okay. So I'm maybe buffered against this because I don't think anybody is accurately in contact with reality. I don't think that's a thing.
Yeah.
And moreover, I think any fixed position of any kind is just an impediment. At some point, you're always trying to cut cake with a hammer. You got to move around. Okay, so that's maybe where my mental block is. It just doesn't occur to me.
Yeah, I was just going to say that there's something else that I've been thinking about that is the other book that I'm reading that's about the different types of stories. And he basically goes into all the different types of genres like comedy, tragedy, the rags to riches stories, all of these. And then he like is now intertwining them to say how they're all kind of centered around the archetypal myth, or like which is more like you get that kind of the archetypal hero's journey sort of, but like how they all follow the same tempo and the same unfolding of the story of like how a hero is kind of formed, or a leader is formed. And this just made me think that like if you ever read like a story that's purely based on the hero's journey, it's like you can't really relate to it. It's very symbolic. It's there's nothing there that you can identify with really. But when you watch horrors or like tragedies or other things like that, those are pieces, lenses that we can look at life through, where you can actually identify with characters within those stories in a way. But that it's interesting that that all of those stories are just kind of like different perspectives depending on which character that you identify with. That will determine whether the story was a tragedy or a comedy. And he gives the example of like David and Goliath, depending on which character you're identifying with will change up what story it is. But the fact that these are like different lenses that all kind of operate around this like common thread that is the truth, that's kind of interesting when you're thinking of it this way, where it's like, yeah, you gotta hop around to every single perspective, to all the different perspectives and like these different sort of narratives before you can kind of get to the truth of it, I guess. Yeah. So
yeah, and you can really curve things if you so there's a Grant Morrison comic, The Invisibles, which ran up until I think 2000, and it's great. It's a good comic. It's a bit dated now, but it's still quite good. It's really quite good. And so I'm going to spoil something if you haven't read this, sorry. So in the first, so just skip ahead if you want to read this. So like in the first bound volume, there's like a sequence where one of the main characters, King Mob, comes in guns a-blazing to gun down the like soulless minions of orthodoxy, right? All these like security guards as they're trying to get, you can imagine the Matrix, right? Every friggin' security guard that they shoot in the hotel lobby and all these dudes, right? Fine. So he guns all these people down there, rescue their guy, they get him out. Good. And then like 4 bound trade paperbacks later, so like, I don't know, 20 issues later or something, there's this issue that comes out of nowhere, and it's this character, and he's like a young boy, he's going through experiences in his youth and 60s and so on and so forth, and eventually he's got kind of an abusive dad, and he goes and he has some traumatic experiences during the Falklands War when England was fighting against Argentina, and then he comes back and he's sort of down on his luck, and like his wife leaves him, but then he meets somebody else, and he's sort of getting his life together, and he gets this private security gig through somebody that he knows, and and then he's reporting to work, and they're sort of shooting the shit and whatever, and then all of a sudden they're like, intruder alert, and this guy suits up and he runs out and he gets shot in the head, and it's just a repetition of a panel from that first battle. And what you just got was the whole life arc of this guard who you dispensed with issues and issues ago.
Yeah.
Right? Never knew his name, came back to him, nothing. Right? He was just a faceless adversary who gets blown away, right? Like a stormtrooper on the way to our hero's ultimate journey. And instead you get to see the life course of this guy in very like high verisimilitude terms, right? With emotional ups and downs and drama, only to have him come into the scene at the last second and boom, and he gets just blown away. And the last thing he sees is like the protagonist running over, and it's jarring, right?
Yeah.
It's one of the brilliant moves that comic makes, which is why I think, well, we could talk about this another time. The comic self-purports to be a hyper-sigil, which draws from the magical work of Austin Osman Spare in Sigils. This is a whole separate conversation. But I think that one of the things that distinguishes a hyper-sigil, if you read the work of Austin Osman Spare, Spare talks about the unification of opposites, so the negation of opposites as a way of introducing a kind of empty space through which contact can be made with the deeper unconscious to have deeper effect, right? So you cancel out opposites in some way, and you cause the mind to blank out in a moment of gnosis, and then you can talk to these deeper layers. And there's a lot of different ways that he proposes doing this. But one of the things I think that Grant Morrison did in that comic, which he lifted from a couple of earlier sources, not least Robert Anton Wilson's Illuminatus trilogy, is that he starts out with a relatively conventional melodramatic genre story of opposing sides, right? Good guys and bad guys with opposing, very easily distinguishable opposed terms, right? Like Star Wars. The good guys are all life-serving, and they wear earth tones, and they have shaggy hair, and they bicker with each other, and they have emotions. And the bad guys are all monochromatic, and they either are robots, dress like robots, are more machine than man now, or they drive around in a robot moon looking to kill a real planet, right? Like it's the technological anxieties of the late 70s writ large. Holy shit, Japanese robots are taking our job, and now their robot planet comes for us. What we need is a shaggy-haired 70s hero to give them what for.
Yeah, so it's the land of knowledge versus the land of experience, sort of like that contrast. Yeah.
Totally, and it's very discreet. But what the hyper-sigil does, it seems, like in Robert Anton Wilson and in The Invisibles, is it gradually erodes those distinctions. And once you kind of get this and you reread it, you can see it happening. There's all this stuff in the story about the Gnostic Christ playing chess against himself. And it's like, right, this constant sort of sense that actually the apparent binary, which is driving the story, is eventually dissolved away.
Yeah.
And when it's dissolved away, boom, that's when it hits you. It's like, what was this fight? Oh, all sides are just one side. There's a unus mundus kind of thing happening. So that kind of dissolving away, in a sense, right, of showing the character's life, it's just not the kind of thing we have. We get a transition where somebody who was just a stereotype, a cartoon, a faceless form of opposition suddenly becomes a person who you followed through this emotional thread, and then big reveal, oh, it was the enemy, right? And that's where you get drama instead of melodrama, instead of those simple things, right?
Yeah. It's so I mean, I'm going to say like something that I've struggled with whenever I've like come across this type of thing. When I first heard of this idea of like the conflict and then like the dissolution, and you've got like kind of the hero that emerges forth or whatever is the one that like kind of ties them together, or that type of thing. I was struggling to understand that in my personal life. Like, how could that possibly be useful to me? Like, what am I supposed to do with that? Because that's like, it's symbolic.
I can see the conflict part of things playing out when it comes to like ideological battles, but I didn't really understand what I'm supposed to do with that. Like what do you do as a person to kind of fix that?
With the hero's journey?
Yeah, well, like what is that in your day-to-day experience? And like there's something that I guess popped into my head yesterday evening. I was trying to put together a diet plan for my mother-in-law, and I've been the person that's so over the past 5 or 6 years, just to give your audience a little bit of a description, I've had to.
They're your audience as well.
They're my audience now. Thank you. I've had to navigate different diets just for medical reasons. And because of this, like I've tried on every single diet underneath the sun, done reading on it. And plus, like I have a love of cooking. So I've tried to make these things interesting and tasty. So now my mother-in-law, who's struggling with cancer, one of the things that we're doing just to kind of support her radiation and chemotherapy is to try and incorporate diet and fasting to see if, whatever we can do to help.
Right.
And
this is what you were talking about with easily accessible nutrients like MCT oil.
Yeah, things
right?
like that. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And all this research on this stuff is like preclinical and like that. So we're not like pegging any, extreme hopes on this. It's more like, well, we'll try it. There's no risk. So
it's hacked citizen science. I know
yeah, exactly. So I've been kind of spearheading this just because I've got a lot of experience. So then I've been speaking with different like nutritionists, as well as people who do research in these areas that are have far more breadth of the scientific studies knowledge than I do, to try and piece together a diet plan for her. But it's been like yesterday when I was sitting down to try and do it, it was like my brain was being pulled in 5 different directions, because there was the competing interests of like the knowledge and the principles that I was trying to incorporate, combined with my own personal experience, combined with my personal relationships that I have with these individuals, and like not wanting to let them down, and wanting to make them something that they would like put together something that they would really enjoy. And as I'm looking at like the rules of keto and what that would actually look like for her to go on like an extreme keto diet, it's like, oh my gosh, like they don't know what they're in for. So it was like, it was just conflict, like it was complete. So then the next, you go to sleep and you wake up, and then you try and think about this from like a more distant perspective, being like, okay, based on my own, what are like a few things that I can do based on stuff that I've made before, and based on just the general principles of understanding here. But you have to like distance yourself from that, and then you just kind of pull those experiences forward and you do those, but it's like within a sense of your limitation. So what can I bring to the table that will help them, understanding that it's like only a few things, but you're going to be fine with that. And that experience, I guess, is like, I've had to do this repeatedly whenever it comes to like even going into any new domain that I'm entering into that I haven't, just any new domain entering into, that if you if you over-identify with it, of all the types of things you're supposed to try and achieve and all the competing interests and things like that, that you're just going to get lost and incredibly anxious. But if you then like pull yourself back, look at your own kind of narrative and path forwards, and then try and find the next reasonable step that is kind of the extension out, that's the point between you and the community that you're trying to serve at that point, or the knowledge space you're also trying to incorporate, that's all you got to do. And that is like the hero kind of the integration aspect, or at least how I can understand it experientially.
That's interesting. So the hero's journey piece, I mean, that's a tricky thing for me. First off, because I try not to believe anything completely, but I have a relatively strong demi-belief that the hero's journey is overemphasized.
Yeah, right? I know you've said this before. Yeah,
that there are other sort of archetypal and mythological movements and arcs which are relevant. And of course, it is the case that you can abstract the hero's journey up to a level whereby you can use it to sort of paint any process of change. But I think if you do abstract it up to that level, you're losing something that is really particular to what the hero's journey is about. And I think that Jung gets at this to a certain extent when he talks about the transition away from the heroic persona. So, for him, the first half of life is about this heroic persona. It's about questing into the world and, right, conquering monsters and achieving treasure and making a life. But then the second half is a very different thing. The second half of life is supposed to be about a turning inwards. It's leaving behind all of that outward jazz. Like, you did it. You got your point of security. Now toss away your shiny shit and your sword and go wandering up the mountain. There's bigger problems to solve. And they're existential problems, and you aren't going to solve them in the same way. Now, arguably, you can look at that stuff as its own kind of heroic journey, but I do think that the heroic journey, as we get hammered with it, right, because it's become a central engine to the Hollywood machine, right? I sometimes worry we're actually burning the archetype out, if such a thing is possible. It may not be. It may be like boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back. Like, it may be ever new, eternally fresh. You just have to dress it up the right way. Right.
The myth that we have to keep rediscovering.
Right. Like what is it? Every generation thinks they invented sex.
Exactly. That was what I was just,
Totally. So, so it may be that it's ever new and ever fresh, and it can always be redressed up. And in theory, that is the very inexhaustible nature of the archetype. I do have like a nervousness sometimes. It's like, oh no, like we're taking something that used to be a campfire sacred rite that you would encounter once a year being told by an elder storyteller, right, in a religious ceremony. And instead, we're cramming our brains full of it day in and day out. And like, what does that do? I don't know. Anyway, but leaving that aside, the heroic journey as it typically gets presented to me seems a little bit like there's a I think it's a Chinese folktale. There's a Chinese folktale, okay, where this old woman lives beside a rich guy's orchard, and she asks if she can have like some surplus apricots, and she makes apricot pie, and she makes the best apricot pies. And this guy has big apricot orchards, and he can't seem to get his pies as good as this woman's pie. So finally he goes to this woman and says, like, well, I gotta know, what's the secret of your pies? And she says, oh, my secret is very simple. I leave you all the best fruit. I take only apricots that are overripe and underripe. And those are what I combine to make my pies. And so you get the high notes and the low notes, as it were.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas all the perfect apricots make somehow a not very interesting pie. And so when I think about that,
I love that.
It's something I think about a lot, right?
Yeah.
Partly because I use it to justify the fact that I'm a creature of extremes. But, something is worth doing, it's worth overdoing, right? It's like an overripe apricot.
You need to be swinging back and forth between the poles in an excessive way.
Yeah, I've justified my bipolar disorder with a Chinese folktale doctor. Anyway, but but there's something to it. And this is sometimes what I think when I think about the hero's journey, which is that the hero's journey by necessity, right, especially as formulated by Campbell, is a kind of rendering down. It's a boiling down, right? It takes, by necessity, a bunch of, at this point, somewhat imperfect anthropological data about mythologies from different cultures, right, and attempts to render some kind of common structure. Now, there's something to that, but just doing that means filing off all the rough edges, filing off all the little cultural peculiarities and stuff until you get something that more or less fits an abstracted higher level shape. Fine.
Yeah.
In practice, the use of that higher level cycle, that abstract cycle, I think actually has to move two directions, weirdly. It both has to drive towards the specific, like it has to connect with actual things in your life. If you keep it at the level of the mythic, it doesn't do much for you.
Well, that's exactly it. Like when you watch like the mythic stories, like you can't identify with the characters. So you don't know what to do with it. And like, even like, as I was trying to use the hero's journey, trying to come up with things for like, to draw somebody through, to draw a teenager through a hero's journey. And it's like, if you try work just from the myth, good luck at like coming up with anything that's actually relevant to somebody that makes any sense. Like what does that mean? Like meeting with the Father? Like, are we going to take
wait
that?
A minute, wait. Is that true? Like, I mean, obviously, at the level of the myth, like if we're talking about the Greek gods, yes, people have a hard time connecting at that level. But like when we're talking about, do you not think kids connect with, I don't know, Harry Potter, Luke Skywalker, Neo from the Matrix, Katniss Everdeen?
Yeah. So, but I think that so I guess I'm speaking more from if there's movies, the creative process in which they knew the hero's journey for those, but they were allowing their understanding of the hero's journey, like they were holding it above them and then allowing the flowers to bloom underneath. Like if that, if there was like a light and then the flowers like kind of grow, and then that's what they wove the story together with. And it wasn't just like a logical process of like, what does that mean? Okay, then I'm going to mechanically sort of move these things through.
For George Lucas, though, it was.
Do you think though that it was that mechanical? Because I don't think that you can come up with the multiple characters in that way, sort of with their personalities weaving through. If it was like it may not have been as. So I guess you may be proving me wrong. Maybe I might be wrong here, but I'm just thinking of, there's a show right now that my husband and I are watching. We're watching the anime series One Piece.
Oh, is that good? That's the pirate one, right?
It's the pirate
for
one.
Like a million years. It's so daunting. I had a student who was mad for it. Yeah, that's what I hear. The student who was mad for it. And I looked and I was like, that's a lot. Like, that's a lot. It's a lot of time. Anyway, but it's good.
It's excellent. I'm like 300 episodes in now, and 300 episodes. I know it's like 15 minutes per episode. But you got to make a habit of it if you want to try and get through it. But the way how he weaves together these different arcs and the characters within them, and he's following the hero's journey, like watching Luffy grow up from he starts off as this wide-eyed character who's just open to experience, who has a dream of becoming the king of pirates, he's like this scrawny kid who's got this one superpower, but he doesn't really know how to use it. He just kind of like reacts to situations and sort of runs head in really brashly and naively, but like
he's a fool.
He's a fool. But through that process, he collects like a team of people who all see that he's a fool, but there's like something that's kind of driving them all together. But then he reaches this point where he then has to start making decisions for others. Like he realizes that in order to keep his team together, and to like protect them, and that he wants to protect them, that he must rise to like a higher standard. And then suddenly he starts to develop a greater like self-control, and he orients himself like consciously towards others, and his strength towards the protection of others and towards it. Anyway, so there's this like shift that happens, and it's the same shift. It's the trajectory of the hero's journey, where first they're reacting unconsciously, and then they learn the truth, and then they start to act consciously, and then they rise back to the surface. But you cannot write the length of episodes that the writer has done, or like the number of like manga books that he's written. You can't do that by without having this kind of sense of you're holding the hero's journey in your mind, but then you're allowing this unconscious sort of like creative voices to speak to you that then fill in that framework, but you let them sort of play out.
Sure. Okay. So in a case like that, I mean, it could be either way, right? It may be that the long arc of this thing was something that had in mind, and then he's coming up with individual creative details to make sure the interest is modulated in a back and forth way. I mean, I'm being real clinical about this, but you can set up things where you understand the dynamics of scene framing and storytelling, right? High action, low action, you want to shift things around. Like you need to keep things moving to keep attention, right? And keep the tension, but then you can have your long arc in mind. In fact, not having your long arc in mind is typically a recipe for disaster. When the first season of Star Trek Picard aired recently, they asked the showrunners afterwards, like, so is there anything you would have done differently? And they were like, well, now we know that if you're going to have like episodic television, you should really work out the whole story in advance. What? What? You didn't know what you were doing before you started filming? This isn't an improv troupe. Anyway, sorry, it's a personal bugaboo. But anyway, so you can have no idea what you're doing and then just try to impose that stuff at the end. That's what they did with Lost. Same crew, by the way.
Oh,
that's
serious?
What they did with Lost. Yeah. The last second, they were like, shit, how are we going to turn this into the hero's journey? Bam. And it was very awkward. So you can try to impose it late. You can have a long arc in mind. It can also be the case that, we're just steeped in this stuff. So there are for sure some writers who are writing not because they have a good structural sense of this sort of thing, but because they know what feels right. Right. And they can be writing sort of by an intuitive way, right? They know their character is growing. They know it has to go back and forth. Like they have an intuitive sense of what makes a story work and they progress it. And I think that probably happens quite often where somebody has sort of a general sense of where they're going, right? But then it's intuitively flowing out. But in Lucas's case, not so. He's the first person, so far as I know, he basically invented the blockbuster along with Spielberg and Jaws, right? And he's the first person to consciously take Campbell and the hero's journey and impose it onto his work. True. Yeah. Because he had a story. He already had the idea. I want to remake Buck Rogers in World War II with space wizards, hairy giants, and neurotic robots.
Yeah.
Right? Okay, sure. And the studio was like, whatever, George. Like, you made some money with American Graffiti. Go do it, buddy. Here's $10 million. It's the 1970s. We no longer know what people want in the cinema. So, whatever, here, take our money. And, at first, what he's got is a hot mess. He talks about it, right? His process of the whatever he called it, the Journal of the Wills or something, was a hot mess. It was just like a hot mess of things until he read this, and then he consciously decided to apply the structure. And when he did, well, then something happens. I mean, this is sort of where I'm fascinated by it, partly because I grew up in the religion of Star Trek or Star Wars, both, I guess. But because it unleashed something, right? Like the kind of mania that Star Wars produced, I think, was remarkable and hadn't been seen before. And right, the extent of the merchandising and it's become a huge, there's a reason Disney slurped it up to power its massive mouse-shaped death robot. Sorry, Disney, I don't mean it. So it's definitely true that I guess what I'm saying is this. When you get that middle layer of myth, right? The hero's journey in the form of myth, it is kind of inaccessible. To apply that into your life in some kind of practical sense, you have to do two things simultaneously. You have to both drop that level, right? Which is a kind of like optimized pi level. You have to drop it down into the featural level of the specifics of your life, while simultaneously raising it out of the specifics of the myth and into a more generalized procedure. The more generalized procedure is simple. It goes like this. There is a problem. You don't know how to solve it. You really don't. You don't know. Finally, you begin to accept that you don't know how to solve it. And there is a series of whispers, whether those are internal urges, external hints, hunches, whatever, that start saying, come on an adventure. Where come on an adventure means go into the unknown. And the unknown can be the external unknown, right? And the unknown can be the internal unconscious, right? And really functionally, those are the same thing. It's a transjective experience a lot of the time, right? You're going through the world, but you're going through it in a very different way that's interfacing with inner material. But, at first you refuse the call. No, I don't want to, right? Everybody refuses the call. I can't go to Alderaan. I've got the crops to bring in or water or whatever it is I do in this farm. Or no, Gandalf, like you take it. You're very tall. You handle the problem. And so there's the refusal. And then finally, it's like, no, look, you have to do it. You have to do it. Why? Because you're simultaneously extremely special, but also perfectly normal. So then we get the, there's like, oh, the journey starts. Oh, actually, this isn't so bad. Oh, some resistance, whatever. Then you're crossing the threshold. Then you start to get into these other confrontations, right? Now, when we get into the specificity of the myth level, right, with something like Star Wars, it's not hard to see the confrontation with the father. Right? or the atonement with the Father, right? The confrontation with the Father and the atonement with the Father are writ large. They're a central part of the story. In fact, they're probably one of the most famous lines in cinematic history, although everybody bungles the lineup. But, you know, join me and together we'll rule the galaxy.
Yeah.
You know, so that stuff is sort of writ in image that's very easy to get at. You read that in a myth, it's harder to get at. When you get into the specificity of it for yourself, but also the highly generalized level of asking the question, well, you know, questions like, well, what is a father? What is a barrier? What is a mother? What is, like, what are we talking about here?
Yeah,
right?
well, that's exactly it. And it's not just like the, so, and maybe part of this is like you read through the hero's journey and then so you understand the types of things you're supposed to be looking for. And then you wait for your own life to kind of go through that arc itself, like at least like a couple times through. And then you can kind of like start to map that stuff onto experience and sort of understand, oh, that's what it feels like to like refuse the, like to actually know what it feels like for like refusal of the call or like atonement with the Father, that it's not just you know, your dad, that it's not just like, but it's like also the way how
although it is often tied up with your dad,
but it's like the way how the principles that and the system in which you grew up in, or like, you know, the people that you admire who have been figures of power in your life and their like interactions that you've had with them, how that like spreads out into your life and, you know, how it affects other areas, to understand that and what that is, that's atonement with the Father. And as you're trying to like break apart from that, like simultaneously respecting it, but then also like developing your own independence, that understanding those symbols in that nuanced of a way, it can't just come from like pure deduction of like, you read the hero's journey and it's like, oh, and then you can watch Star Wars and be like, well, I'm going to be facing Darth Vader at some point.
Right.
That's, you know what I mean?
Yeah, sure. It seldom cashes out in quite those terms, insofar as our regular lives seem very prosaic, very mundane, right? So it's like, and now I have to face the dragon. Fuck does that mean? What does that mean? Oh, it means your mother is kind of clingy and smothering. Right? Or whatever. Like it means, you know, what's the refusal of the call? Well, the refusal of the call is chickening out. The refusal of the call is not paying attention to your sort of moral intuitions about a situation, right? Not standing up when you feel that you should stand up. You know, it's
but the problem is like when you're embedded in those circumstances, you're like, well, this is understandable. There's all these reasons. And then it's not like a categorical thing that you'll, you know?
Yeah, in general, I'm opposed to the notion that we somehow always magically know what to do. You know, I find that idea very peculiar. Maybe I'm just a deeply broken person, but I find that I very often don't know what to do, right? And this is my point about melodrama versus drama in part, right? Drama is not about good versus evil, right? Melodrama is about good versus evil. But the whole point of drama versus melodrama is that it has a higher degree of verisimilitude and connection, right? Drama is about choosing between two goods, choosing between two evils. That's what drama is about. It's circumstances where actually you can understand all sides and it's tough.
Yeah.
It's not easy. To me,
well, it's like what
that's
you're
the
talking
primary
about.
Component that life is made of.
Yeah, it's what we were talking about like right at the beginning. And I mean, maybe you can tell us now like what your Monster Island position is regarding evil.
Okay, sure. Okay, so many years ago, I knew a guy, we'll call him Jack. So Jack was a friend of a friend, so I'll call him an acquaintance. And when I first moved to the city and I met Jack, Jack was all charm. A very handsome guy, blonde, fit, good looking, funny, smart. Clearly had a bit of an alcohol issue, but whatever, he was young, and he was an actor and a comedian. So, you know, he made quite good money and he did comedy. He had like 1,000 watts of personality, you know? And when I first met Jack, he really blasted me like in a, like, I'm going to be your best friend, arm around the shoulder kind of way, which I found off-putting because I didn't know Jack. Like it was just a bit much. I was considerably more introverted then. Building up my extroversion has been a project of many years, you know? So I was considerably more introverted. So I was a bit off-put by this behavior on Jack's part. And so, you know, so I responded friendly, cordially, but I certainly didn't like rise to the huzzah, we're best friends moment. At which point Jack very rapidly cooled towards me, and he proceeded to be quite cool, bordering on actually a bit nasty towards me for a number of years afterwards, because we were sort of moving in the same social circles, and that too sort of led me to a bit of confirmation that I was like, okay, so like somebody who will turn on a heel like this is not somebody, like my intuition is correct. There's something a bit fakey about this. Other people responded very well to him. We had a mutual friend, and so he was often about, and I think he was always a little puzzled by my social positioning in the group, because I obviously was respected and well regarded, but I think he often couldn't figure out why, because I was doing something very different than what he was doing. Very different. And so he would kind of take digs, and I would play straight man. So he would do whatever, and I would play straight man and whatever. And this, you know, whatever, it was just sort of an arm wrestling thing that we had going on for a long time. Anyway, years later, Jack, I hear through our mutual friend, we're talking, and he says, da 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 da, like, didn't you hear? Jack's got cancer. And I say, holy shit, really? And he says, yeah, Jack's got cancer, terminal lung and lymphoma. And I'm like, oh my God. And to my way of thinking, I promptly jumped to the conclusion, as a good Jungian, oh my God, it's psychogenic, right? This is like it's clearly psychogenic. This is a person with a deep self-destructive streak, and now their body has turned on them in an act of self-destruction. But I felt bad for him, right? And so so apparently Jack had been at their house, and at one point he had gone into the bathroom, he'd been coughing and coughing and coughing and coughing. And he was a pretty heavy drinker, liked to use cocaine a fair bit, smoked, whatever, but like really hacking, and hacked up a bunch of blood. And our mutual friend came in and was like, holy shit, like, are you okay, Jack? And Jack said, no, you know, like, I've got cancer, lung and lymphoma, like I'm starting my chemo next week. And they were like, holy shit. So when I saw Jack the next time, I said to him, hey, you know, Jack, look, you know, I know we're not exactly close, but in this particular case, if you ever want to talk to somebody, right, and you want to talk to somebody about this, I'm happy to listen. And maybe because we're not as close, it might be easier to talk about some stuff if you want to, right? And he was like, you know, thank you for the offer. I think I'm okay, but thanks, I appreciate the offer. So, so meanwhile, you know, Jack, our mutual friend's uncle comes down with cancer, and Jack was there. The uncle is on the dock at the cottage bawling because he's about to get chemo, and Jack's there with his arm around him saying, you know, you don't worry about this. Like, we're going to make it. We're going to make it. We're going to make it through this, you know? So Jack starts in on his chemo appointments, but meanwhile, it's the summer, and, you know, when you know somebody and they have a terminal illness, you know, they kind of get to call the shots. And so we're like, you know, Jack, what do you want to do? And what Jack wanted to do was party every single night. And so Jack was pretty generous, and we spent a very bleary set of 2 months, basically hitting, you know, like bars and clubs and stuff pretty much every single night. And Jack was spending money like it was, you know, going out of style. So whatever, that was fine, right? He was very generous. I'll give him that. He was very generous. Anyway, so time goes by. Jack's coming around less. And I'm like, okay, well, he was often kind of in and out. And finally he shows up at our mutual friend's house, and, you know, he asks our mutual friend, he says, hey, mutual friend, I was wondering if I could get a reference. A mutual friend says, what do you need a reference for? And Jack says, oh, I'm applying to the military. The mutual friend says, well, here's the thing, Jack. If you apply to the military, aren't they going to do like a full physical and discover that you have cancer, you have lung and lymphoma? And Jack says, And mutual friend says, Jack, do you have cancer? And Jack says, no. And mutual friend says, did you ever have cancer? Jack says, no, I never had cancer. A mutual friend says, what are people going to think? And Jack says, people are going to think what they're going to think. Now, your reaction to this, and that was the end of Jack's participation in the social group, which I'm not entirely sorry about. Now, here's the thing. Jack is displaying what? Classic psychopathy. This is not an allowed DSM category anymore. We would have to call it antisocial personality or narcissistic personality or whatever the hell you want to call it. But if you just run it on the hair spectrum, it's a profound lack of right? Because the unbelievableness of this, right, is like, and I'm sure this is the same reaction you're having. Who does that? Who does that? Who does that? Who says they have cancer so that their friends will go out for drinks more or whatever?
I would say that it's not unexpected because I've encountered people like this before, but it's more like this guy. Are you serious?
So this was my first encounter with this guy.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
I had encountered people, arguably even psychopaths. I think I hung around with a couple psychopaths in high school, but then they were our psychopaths, and that's a whole other story.
Yeah.
You got to have a few in the tribe just to keep rival psychopaths at bay. Here, have an extra donut. Make sure that if that guy comes close, you kill him.
Yeah.
Here's your apple fritter.
Yeah.
No, but this was the first time I had encountered it in this form, and it was the unthinkableness of it. To me, prior to that, it was just it's just unthinkable. I didn't, he wasn't my friend exactly, but I knew him and he knew these people. He was friends with them. It was just unthinkable. This with the uncle, we're going to make it through all this jazz. Right?
Yeah.
And his hair wasn't falling out. Now, a friend of mine who disliked him a great deal more than I did was like, Jack doesn't have fucking cancer. He's a liar.
And he said this right from the beginning?
Yeah, to me. And I said, no, dude, come on, man.
People don't lie about that type of thing.
Yeah, right. So this was a very eye-opening experience for me, because prior to that, I had the idea that basically that there was no such thing as evil, right? That there's no such thing as evil. There's only sickness.
Yeah.
And all sickness can be approached compassionately, and all sickness can be dealt with. Now, to be fair, I still believe that. However, the difference is this. What I learned from Jack was that, yes, it is true, I believe, that there is no evil. There is only dysfunction, right? However, some forms of dysfunction are so deep and so entrenched that there is nothing that can be reasonably done. So what does it take to treat psychopathy? And I've talked about efforts to do so, the extremely ill-fated Total Encounter capsule here in Canada, right? Efforts to do something about this, and it's just really hard. Maybe there's something you could do. Maybe if you had somebody working with them for 25 years nonstop or something, but the resources aren't there, and the techniques aren't there. So what do you do? What do you do? And if you can't do anything, then what are your options? And the options can't be that you just allow them to mingle freely and do whatever they want. Right. And so the answer is, I'm sorry, you're not evil, but nevertheless, you have to go live on Monster Island.
Yeah. Banishment.
Basically, that's what I came to. And I was like, that is not a satisfying answer, but that's all I've got. You have to go live on Monster Island now. Because you are not playing by the rules in some way. And that's not even quite true, because obviously our particular civilization actually elevates psychopathy in a number of instances, which is why it's overrepresented in some positions. And there's even positions that it's good for. I want my surgeon to be a psychopath. I want it. I want him to be cool as a cucumber and totally concerned with the self-aggrandizing God complex of perfectionism. That's what I want.
As long as he's bought into the structure that he's trying to become the best surgeon, and that he's not doing funny stuff when you're on the surgical table that's for his own design.
You can say sex zombie, it's okay.
Sex zombie, exactly.
No, that's awful. Probably gonna have to cut that in post. Anyway, I'm gonna get in trouble. But anyway, so wait, how did we get around to psychopathy?
So we were talking about how dramatic or how drama,
right?
That like usually it's the case of the battle of like two individual or two goods or two bads, where it's not really clear and it's not exactly a case of good and evil.
Right. And so in general, that like, what to do stuff sits very poorly with me. I actually think most people are existing in a state of ambivalence that's not unreasonable. Right? It's complicated. And the primary tools that one needs to navigate are kind of interoception and emotional acuity. Most people don't actually have, and is getting actual interference from other portions of their mind psychodynamically. So this is one of the things I think actually that the hero's journey points to. When you're talking about the confrontation and the atonement with the father, right? Well, what's the father? One way of looking at the father, right, is looking at the father in sort of this like patriarchal law and reality structure and, like the system of rules and socially received this and that and the other thing. And in my opinion, if people don't go through a rebellious phase against things as they are, something has gone a bit off. Like, I think you should. I think, I say this.
But you got to test the line.
Yeah. So I say this as a wild child speaking to another wild child. So this may be,
exactly.
you got to strap on your combat boots and kick some TVs.
Part of growing up.
Part of growing up. Right. But then equally, if you just stay in that space in an unregenerate fashion, right? I think that's also mistaken. Like, yes, it's important to push off of these things, right? Because let's face it, like, the world is fucked up. It's fucked up and we've made a mess of it, right? Like,
none of us know what we're doing.
None of us know what we're doing. No. This was my
don't know what they're doing.
No, my great revelation at 12 was realizing that there was nobody at the wheel.
Yeah.
Like, and that the adults who had very confidently stated certain things, actually their lives were fucking dog's breakfast too.
And if you ask anybody at any stage of life, they will all say anybody who's a bit self-aware will all say the exact same thing, which is like, I entered into this boardroom at this new job and nobody knew what they were doing. And it's like in government, like, we were having this big conversation and it's like, nobody really knew. It was just a bunch of people with opinions. And the idea is that, like, you've gained some life experience, so your instincts and opinions that you have are grounded in stuff that's relevant. Like, that's obvious, but like,
and this plays into like the imposter syndrome we were talking about. There is a weird play here, which is like, on one hand, you're kind of just making it up as you go. Right. But on the other hand, every once in a while something happens and you realize, it's like like a second year undergrad student who still thinks that they know nothing until they go home for Thanksgiving and their uncle starts spouting off about psychology. And they're like, well, actually.
Yeah.
Right. And you suddenly realize, oh, actually, I know a bunch of shit. Right. I actually do know things.
Yeah.
And then gradually you realize you know a lot more than you thought you knew, and you're still making it up.
It's because you're facing on or the edge of uncertainty that you're walking along makes it so that you're constantly, you constantly have this sense that like people on that edge as well don't know what they're doing because we don't. But it's like also this idea that I often think about where when we originally like talked about child development, that it was like, you've got your stages of development, which are true. Like there's like objective stages of development, but then they had this idea that, you develop reasoning at a certain stage of your life, but then they've like drawn the line back now to being like, oh yeah, but like babies can actually do deductive reasoning only with like stuffed animals.
And run experiments and stuff. Yeah,
exactly. So it's like, okay, so we have the same fundamental processes that we're using all the time. So this idea of like, looping it back to our other conversation we had about imagination and play, it's like, no, like those things should not just be given up at a young age because you're constantly needing to, break apart these structures, these old goals and authoritative structures that are dying, that are from like a past life. And you're constantly needing to break those apart to bring in new life to them and like to regenerate them, because we're constantly going through this cycle of like life and death in smaller circles throughout our life perpetually. It's repeated a pattern. It's not just like a linear line or a linear thing where it's like, okay, good, I'm done growing up now.
Right.
That's it.
And the solutions that you locate often become the foes of a few cycles later. Right? You find a workaround, you find a personality structure, it solves your immediate problem, and eventually it becomes so entrenched, it's tyrant that it itself must be overturned. This is the thing, your rebellion gets you out of the loop, you push back, right? But if you can't then later go back and retrieve some of the value, if you maintain this absolutely binary perspective where you're like, everything that was garbage, there's nothing worthwhile in it, you all you've done is flip. You've just flipped to the other side, which is equally blunt, not nuanced, right? I think that one of the things that stymies people about the hero's journey is the time scale. So this is the thing. I see people a lot attempting to apply the hero's journey into a very small time scale, like the hero's journey of today. And that's a thing I guess you can do, right? If it's just like, what do I have to do? I have to turn towards the strange, right? Turn to face the strange, I suppose is the David Bowie, right? Turn to face the strange. I have to move towards what I'm afraid of on purpose. And I have to, right? I have to identify what's coming from me and what's an externally imposed load of horseshit and whatever. And right, there's that.
Trying to go about it intentionally to be transformative.
Right. And I think that misses a little something. And I think what it misses is that the time scale of the hero's journey is about step one. I don't know. If I knew what to do, if I had the tools to do it, if it was already in me, then the predicament at the start wouldn't be there. You have to have exhausted your conscious resources first. And once you exhaust them and you're still hammering up against the impasse, that's when the hero's journey starts. Because the hero's journey is getting the call, the knock, right, and finding out that you have allies, that there are magical helpers, but there are also things. All of that is about moving into the space where you're looking where you haven't looked.
Yeah.
That's the very essence of it. By its very nature, you can't know. And people so badly want to fit it into a frame where it serves their existing ego goals.
Yeah, exactly.
They have an ego goal and they're like, I know what to do. I just have to keep pushing even harder, doing the same thing. And it's like, no. At a certain point, you're like, no, this isn't working. And so now I have to open myself up. I have to admit that. And when you do, what you're looking for is this stuff that kind of grabs you and pulls you, the serendipity, the happenstance, the synchronicity, right, externally, but then also the stuff that starts to churn up, the weird dreams that start to come up, or the strange fancies, or you start to get super interested in a piece of music and you don't know why. Right before we started recording, for some reason, I had Madonna stuck in my head and I don't know why. Last night I dreamt of San Pedro. I don't know where it came from. Anyway, I got an iPod in my mind. So, there's this surrender to the mystery of it. And I think that gets missed, and it operates on a relatively long time scale. Trying to hammer that into an hour or a day or a week is tricky. It's operating on a longer, kind of almost a seasonal sort of scale. And it's not a time scale that we're good at thinking in.
Yeah. I mean, like there's things that can happen like from the cycle of like night to day and things like that. But this idea of it's surrendering to that unconscious piece of like the things that call you forward, or those like sparks that are there. And I still remember like the moment when I was making a career shift, and it was a lot of the stuff that we were talking about with like role playing and games and stuff like that, when I started to enter into that space and just talking about D&D, and it was just this like thing that captured my attention, and it's like calling to you, being like, there's something here for you. And it's the same thing that happens when you're reading a book and suddenly like a line jumps out at you, and you just like, and you just like, you want to underline it, or like a certain like lyric or whatever in a song will just like call to you. And it's like, and it calls to you almost in a way that's like, it's independent of the context sometimes of which the person was speaking it through, or like, it's not necessarily like embedded in what like the meaning that the person had for it, but it just kind of jumps out at you. And
what's interesting to you? And then of course the deeper question is, why is it interesting? And you can ask that a bunch of times without necessarily getting to it. But this is the like, stop assuming you know what you're doing. Just follow your nose, where your nose in this case, and I'm a big believer in this. I'm like, what are you interested in? And when I ask that, it's not just like, well, I don't know, I'm sort of interested. It's like, no, what's catching your interest? What are the things that jump out at you? Right? And then you start to follow those things without shutting yourself down with a bunch of self chatter. This is a stupid waste of time. It has nothing to do with what I'm doing. How do you know?
Exactly. Or like, this is leading me like astray or whatever. But there are some things that do lead you astray, but often like you'll notice that these things that start to capture you, that
the images that then pop into your mind, and that the other things that start to then like come to your attention when you start opening your eyes to those little serendipitous sort of encounters or other things, that they start to form together into an image or into a pattern, and then into like an idea, and that that they cluster together into that pattern that you can then, this is like this new thing that you can identify with.
Yeah, and it goes from there's something here to stepping back and being like, oh, holy shit, there's something here.
Yeah.
Right? It's like stepping back from the pointillist painting, like the sparks start to line, and then suddenly you step back and you realize you're looking at the constellation of an entirely new life.
Yeah, exactly.
And that it's doable, but first you have to leave behind the idea that if you knew the answer already, you wouldn't be stuck.
Yeah.
Right. And so all of the like critical ideas you have, no, not this, you don't know. If you knew, you wouldn't be stuck there. But that's it's a radical opening and a real insult and imposition to the ego, which is just white knuckling on the throne to stay in charge, right? So I'm in charge of this meal, but it's just like, no, you're not. And unless we pull on some other resources, we are going to be screwed, and we're going to get like sclerotized, calcified into form. Okay, I have to wrap up because I got another meeting in like 2 minutes. But how many points did we get through?
We got through one.
Okay, good.
We got through one. I mean, and it was actually kind of funny as I was reflecting as we were talking, and I was like, we didn't really come to like a solution exactly, but we've kind of danced around it, and like we've played out what these masculine and feminine archetypes look like just through the conversation in these different domains. So I think that somebody who's listening may have come to a solution, or like may have a general understanding that they'll walk away from, hopefully, from the conversation. Yeah,
right. They could maybe abstract it. Just here's a pro tip, folks. Christine has way more masculine archetype than I have. Mine is like way more. I mean that as a compliment, which is to say that like I dragged mine in a very hard-won way out of the archetypal corpse of my still living and much loved father. You come by yours much more naturally. You've got the warrior spirit on the court. You've got, so pay attention to that. I'm a very receptive, not that you're not receptive, that's not what I'm saying. Okay, I'm digging myself in here. So the answer is, let's do this again, because I don't think we're done. We are circumambulating.
We still have to talk about all the specifics of the practical stuff with the games and things like that. So,
so let's set this in. We'll look at the points next time.
Yeah, we're getting there.
It's fine. We're orbiting around. Everything's going to come together. Or it won't, but it will. It will. Nothing is ever wasted. So we'll do this again. What am I doing? I'm taking the motorcycle up north tomorrow. Maybe early next week.
Yeah, that'd be great. Or maybe.
Okay, well, we'll talk.
We'll
figure it out. Okay, and then I'll send you a link to this, and you can take a look, and then I'll maybe post the two up once I got once I got the opener worked out. But we got to come back around. There's more here.
There's a lot more.
There's a lot more here. Okay. Okay. Good. Have a good day. Lovely as always to talk to you. And I'll talk soon, and we will work out our time.
Sounds good.
Okay.
Okay.
see, there's the mistake. I'm not an expert.